One of the strengths of George Washington was his determination and courage. Despite the setbacks and failures he experienced during the Revolutionary War, he still continued to instill discipline and train his soldiers. And eventually, the Continental Army led by Washington triumphed over the British force. And years after the war ended, he became the president of the Constitutional Convention, and he was successful in establishing a new government of United States. During his time as a president and a general, he risked his life. He showed his tremendous courage by risking his life, risking his reputation, his wealth for his countrymen. George Washington treated his people and subordinate with respect and dignity. He's a leader that against tyranny and support individual freedom. He had faith, believed in his men, and treated everyone equally with same respect, no matter the rank. Despite being considered one of the greatest leaders, however, George Washington was not a good tactician. Sometimes he made silly mistakes and he lacked of good strategy. It happened during the French and Indian War, where a group of British troops led by George Washington and another group which consists of Mingo warriors, and they are approaching the French army base. When they reached the French army base, they started a surprise attack and their leader was killed. And then the leader of the Mingo warrior claimed that Washington started the war first and should take responsibility. As a result, Washington was accused of starting an unprovoked attack during peacetime. Because of Washington's carelessness, he didn't realize that he was being used by the leader of Mingo warrior, and he didn't have any good strategy and tactics to overcome such situation. And ultimately, George Washington unintentionally started a war between the British soldier and the French army.
As the first President of United States of America, George Washington portrayed 5 leadership traits. Firstly, humility. George able to connect everyone and everything was compassion. He also expressed gratitude towards everything that is contributed by his subordinates. Even though Washington stayed humble in time of his power and growth, he able to get such a good rapport, respect and trust from his peers, people and society. Next, George Washington reflects initiative traits in his career that maintain the liberties of America. If Washington, as a founding father of America, did not fight to create and protect the America's liberties, America might not be the greatest power of this world right now. In addition, Washington also was characterized by decisiveness and prudence. Washington very careful in his decision making. As a soldier also, Washington is more perseverance to avoid mistakes that might be fatal than to perform exploits that are splendid. Washington also will never act until each situation and each thought has been weighed very carefully before he make any decision. George Washington will refrain any doubt in his decision, but once the decision has been made, he will oppose any obstacle and will go towards his decision and strive towards the objective of what has been decided. As a consequence, George's reasonable dynamic will take his country toward victory, war and stability in administration. George Washington portrayed confidence throughout his career. He picked his partner very consciously and increased trust around him, everyone around him. Washington is a man of extraordinary uprightness, and he also held himself with self-assurance and poise. Washington also has a look, course of a man familiar with respect and to be obeyed. He was not grim, and there's no arrogance in his sense of personality. Friendly and humble are words often used to describe him. He was cautious about whom he connected and the impacts towards his general accomplishment. So a trait for George Washington is determination. Despite numerous difficulties during battlefields of Revolutionary War, Washington gave tireless effort to train his men and to impart discipline in his men. This permit him to train and lead the Continental Army to the victory over the Great Britain.
There are two values that we can learn from George Washington leadership. First is integrity. During his time of service to the west of mountains, Washington has developed an alliance with the Native American to understand better about the land and the people. He also learned about the Native American tactic to influence on his future leadership in military battles. As the first president of the United States, he was cautious not to make the office a concentrated seat of power. So he helped form a way to rule the new country. He carefully tried to model on how the leader of his new nation was supposed to behave, and the specific on how the new nation will function. He put the best leader of the moment to build the first cabinet. Finally, he formed the first cabinet and engaged the greatest mind of the period to bring divergence for a viewpoint to the surface in order to find the best way forward. The second value is selfless service. George Washington also shows selfless service value. As a young man, George Washington felt called to military service and served in his early career in the rough area of the Ohio Valley. Washington's bravery was clearly seen, although the major battles he faced were not always successful. Washington had suffered alongside its soldiers in the war, and he did not take leave through the entire conflict. George Washington was a principled man who worked hard to become a new kind of leader for a new kind of country. He has a good sense of honor, and he puts the needs of his country ahead on his own. His ability to delegate his personal interests to the public, good in both public conduct and behavior, serve as an example for others to emulate.
One of the leadership principles of George Washington is he will seek responsibility and take responsibility for his action. George Washington first became a slave owner at the early age of 11 when Washington's father Augustine died in 1743. Despite having been an active slaveholder for 56 years, George Washington struggled with the institutions of slavery and spoke frequently of his desire to end the practice. At the end of his life, Washington made the decisions to free all his slaves in his 1799 will. Besides that, George Washington knows his people and looked out for their well-being. Washington proved to be a better general than military strategist. His strength lay not in his genius on the battlefield, but in his ability to keep the struggling colonial army together. His troops were poorly trained and lacked food, ammunition, and other supplies. Soldiers sometimes even went without shoes in winter. However, Washington was able to give them the directions and motivations. His leadership during the winter of 1777 and 1778 at Valley Forge was a testament to his power to inspire his men to keep going. This action effectively ended the Revolutionary War, and Washington was declared a national hero. Moreover, George Washington set the example by playing a key role in adopting and ratifying the Constitution, and was then twice elected president by the Electoral College. He implemented a strong, well-financed national government while remaining impartial in a fierce rivalry between cabinet members Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton. During the French Revolution, he proclaimed a policy of neutrality while sanctioning the Jay Treaty. He set enduring precedents for the office of president, including the title Mr. President, and his farewell address is widely regarded as a preeminent statement of republicanism. George Washington was notably democratic when guiding the US government. He showed early signs of his democratic leadership style by appointing strong leaders to his staff. Washington decided he needed a group of advisors he could turn to. He modeled his new cabinet on the councils of war he had led as a commander of the Continental Army. George Washington's cabinet included just 4 original members, which are Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson, Secretary of Treasury Alexander Hamilton, Secretary of War Henry Knox, and Attorney General Edmund Randolph. His decisions not to serve a third term exemplified a democratic leader who knows when to pass the torch.
So about George Washington's leadership behavior, his leadership behaviors are both task-oriented and people-oriented, meaning that he paid close attention to his people's work. He was keenly interested in their performance and the outcome, but at the same time, he was also a leader that exhibits concern for the welfare of his people. Washington treated the men he led with dignity and respect. He had faith and belief in his men, whatever their rank was. Washington was against tyranny and he valued individual freedom. Therefore, he did not act like a tyrant and extended freedom to others. He always provided moral courage and instilled a sense of confidence to his people. He also placed his people's welfare above his own. Despite his utmost care and concern for his people, he also very much concerned for his task and his outcome. As a military general, his major ideas were simple: is to win a war, no matter how long it took. As a military leader, he was hard and strict on his men in training to prepare them for the hardships they would face in battle. As a visionary leader, Washington developed an organization and hoped his people worked hard and provided full support to achieve the goal of winning the war for the independence of America. George Washington is often commended as a man of character. As a political leader, military general, and the first president of the United States of America, he had a good reputation for his integrity, honor, and dedication to his country. However, there was one ethical issue that might affect his image as a man of character, and it was all about slave ownership. George Washington's ownership of slaves had been a highly controversial issue. He became a slave owner at the early age of 11. He had been an active slave holder for 56 years, and at the time of his death, he had enslaved about 317 people. On numerous occasions, there were people enslaved by George Washington ran away in an attempt to regain their freedom. Ironically, despite having a large number of slaves, Washington considered slavery to be wrong, but he was not willing to free the hundreds of slaves he owned during his lifetime. He did eventually free them in 1799. However, he freed them at the time his life ended due to throat infection.